Hi, my name is Eyal. Together with me is Sagi. We are both doing security research in CrowdStrike, and Yaron contributed to the research significantly, but is not here right now. So let's see. So the talk today is about a technique that is quite overlooked. It is called disinjection. In the context of this technique, we establish MiTM and we convince the machine that we are the domain controller. We will see that this technique is useful both in the context of Kerberos and NTLM. These are the main authentication protocol in Active Directory environment. Okay, so the plan for today's talks. First, we present NTLM. We'll introduce the protocol. We'll then see related known vulnerabilities and mitigations. And then we'll see a new attack that is NTLM injection. And afterwards, we'll switch over to Kerberos. We'll introduce the protocol. We'll see related vulnerabilities and mitigations, and we'll see three new cases. Now, I just like to mention that the impact of this vulnerability or technique is really across the board, involving different vendors and products, and I'm sure that you could find more. So what is NTLM? NTLM is a legacy authentication protocol in Active Directory. It was largely superseded by Kerberos. It's in the style of challenge response. Now, when a user wants to authenticate to a server, first he sends a message about its capabilities. Then there's a random challenge from the server, and the client responds with a response to the challenge based on the user's secret key. Now, the server relays this authentication to a domain controller since the server doesn't aware of the user password. Now, the domain controller approves or rejects the session and provides the session key. So, okay, there is one thing to note here. You can allow a server sign-in, client sign-in, use the most secure settings in GPU. Still, nothing in LTLM or DSS API, the encapsulating protocols, prevent the option of impersonating the destination server. Actually, the identity of the server does return in the challenge message, but due to, I guess, some canonization difficulty, clients don't compare it with what they expect. And that means that a malicious entity can set up a server and provide rogue responses to the requests. So let's see how it looks. Now, if a client wants to connect to a server, it first sends the negotiate message. This is intercepted by an attacker that sends a challenge. Now, as mentioned, the client machine does not verify the target name and sends back a response. Now, the rogue server should have a valid identity in the Active Directory, username or password or machine name and machine password, and thus could actually just, it must be a machine, but it could then relay the session to, not relay, relay the session to a DC and get the session key. So then it is able to serve further requests from the client and to inject malicious data, potentially. Now, this technique kind of resembles NTLM relay, but there's quite a difference. In NTLM relay, the authentication is relayed to another server that is attacked, actually. But in our case, we attack the client, we inject data. Notice that there is nowadays a protection mechanism against NTLM relay, which is server signing and client signing, and it's only possible in unsecure settings or quite rare cases. So actually, the classical case of this attack was discovered by Luke Jennings, and it involves a group policy update where an attacker can intervene in this process and, for example, update logon script or something similar to achieve remote code execution. And the fixes by Microsoft for this attack are really specific to group policy. And first, group policy retrieval can no longer be done with NTLM, that is LDAP and MSRPC. And secondly, SMB, that is the protocol that is responsible for obtaining the group policy files, is blocked from usage on certain paths. Okay, so let's now see our new contribution. So it's about Azure AD Connect, and just generally, Azure AD Connect Azure AD is part of the vision of seamless sign-on, where a user can use its internal Active Directory credential while surfing on the web to access external resources such as Office 365 or some internal applications without the need of a VPN or something similar. And the way it works is the following. We have Azure AD Connect server on-prem that on the one hand retrieves password information and other data from domain controllers on the network, and on the other hand, upload this information hash to the Azure Active Directory. This way, the Azure Active Directory is able to verify authentication requests by users. And the thing is that there is no verification that the domain controller is a real domain controller, which means that an attacker could intervene in this process and send fake password updates. So how it works? We should have a full MiTM between the AD Connect server and the DC. Now the AD Connect server tries to communicate by Kerberos, but since Kerberos failed, we make it fail. It reverts to NTLM, and at this point, the attacker relays LDAP packets to the original server and only handles MSRPC packets that are domain replication. Now, the way to retrieve the passwords is by using domain replication protocol, the RSU API, and by answering with a new malicious change to the directory, we can introduce a fake password into the database. So let's just now see the demo. So here we see the attacker's view, and we want to inject password, NTLM injection into this account, EK test. And clearly, first, the password is not NTLM injection, but another password. So now we have two things that we do. We first have a modified version on Mimikatz, of Mimikatz in the window above. And secondly, we have LDAP relay server on the window below. And now we wait for the synchronization to occur. And it usually takes a minute or two, but I sped it up. And now, okay, we can see that a new change was pulled. And so we can try to connect with our new password. And now we try several times as it takes time for the password to be uploaded to Azure AD account. So let's try. Okay, not yet. Yeah. Okay. So we are lucky in the third time. And now we can look at the network packets. So we can see that the packets that return from the attacker machines are the domain replication packets, and we'll see this is that forward station 01 is the attacker's machine, and LDAP is returned from the original domain controller that is that for DC01. So now we've achieved the account takeover essentially, and we can do what we want with that user in Azure. So the response of Microsoft is the following. They did not consider it a vulnerability, mostly because it is NTLM, and they considered it rather a configuration issue, and partly because it requires MiTM, and MiTM is considered an elevated position. Okay, while we strongly agree with Microsoft recommendations here that are true for any situation almost, we do think it should be considered a vulnerability and fixed accordingly. It's worth to mention that there is also plenty of research in MiTM and plenty of ways to achieve MiTM, like Slack attack, outsourcing, and so on. So it's really practical. And I'll stress again the main point that there is really no protection mechanism against this attack that is built in by default. And there might be specific solutions in specific cases. So let's now switch over to Sagi. He will explain about Kerberos.
Thanks, Eyal. Now let's see how we can use the DC injection technique with Kerberos. First, let's go over some basics. Kerberos is an Active Directory authentication protocol. It was added sometime after NTLM, and its main goal was to make the authentication process more secure. The Kerberos authentication process is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, the user will prove his identity to the domain controller, and in return, the domain controller will return a ticket granting ticket, or TGT in short. Next, when the user wants to access a server, it will go back to the domain controller with the TGT and ask for a service ticket. In the service ticket request, the user will include a service principal name, which is basically the server name, and the name of the service it wants to use, something like LDAP or SIX. After verifying the TGT, the domain controller will return a ticket granting service, which the user will then use when contacting the server. The TGT is encrypted with the server key since it's intended to be verified by the server. When the user establishes a channel against the server, it will send the TGS. The server will then be able to verify it since it's encrypted with its secret. And also it can take from it a session key that was also shared with the user, and they can both use that session key to establish a signed or encrypted channel in other protocols. To have some more background on our attack, let's first talk about KDC spoofing. KDC spoofing is an old attack technique that was used to bypass authentication on network equipment like VPNs and firewalls. A user logs onto a server using plain text credentials, and the server uses those credentials to generate an ACE request. An attacker using MiTM intercepts that request and returns a fake reply. Basically, the reply is fake since the attacker doesn't have the necessary secret to create a real one. And also, the server doesn't have the necessary secret to validate the reply, so it just approves the user's logon. To mitigate this attack, another step to the authentication process was added. Now, after receiving the ACE reply, the server uses the included TGT and asks the domain controller for a service ticket, with itself as the target. The domain controller returns a valid service ticket, and since the target is the server itself, it can validate the ticket and know that the user and the domain controller are genuine, and only then it can approve the user's logon. This process of asking the service ticket to serve is usually done with the SPM of host. So as we're seeing, we cannot manipulate the authentication process itself and the tickets. So what can we do? Let's take a look at how a typical workstation enumerates the domain and selects the best DC to work against. So the process itself of the enumeration and the DC selection is done using a combination of DNS queries and LDAP searches, unauthenticated LDAP searches, I might add, until the best DC is chosen. Only then, a network on session will be established against the chosen DC and some messages will pass over it. This is the most crucial part, since to be able to establish a network on session and reply to messages, the target server must have the client machine secret. That means it's a genuine DC. So as we have seen, the process of selecting the DC itself is not secure unless some form of validation is done afterwards. So what can we do with this? We can convince the client machine that we are the DC, and afterwards we can just relay all Kerberos requests to a real DC. Then when the client wants to ingest data from the DC, our fake DC, we can serve any malicious data we want back to the machine. Let's take a look at the attack flow. The client machine starts the DC selection process, and we inject our fake DC. Then when the authentication process starts, we just relay all the messages to a real DC and then back to the client until the authentication finishes. And again, the process of asking a TGS for host will work since the DC is genuine and we return a real TGS. Then, when a client wants to ingest data from the DC, we are the DC, so we are the target service it needs. So it asks for a service ticket. And since our machine is a valid machine in the domain, and we have pre-registered all the STMs we need, the DC will serve the ticket, and the channel will be established against our DC with the chosen protocol. Note that the channel can even be signed or encrypted since a valid TGS is used to create it. Then we can serve any malicious data we get. So what do we need for the attack to work? We need an application that uses Kerberos that ingests data from the DC without validating it. And of course, does dynamically search for DCs and does not use a fixed list. We will also need a man in the middle between the DC, between the client application and at least the DNS server. And lastly, we will need a valid machine account in the domain with the ability to register the SPMs we need on it. This can be achieved by using the machine account quota policy, which is turned on by default and allows any user in the domain to create up to 10 machine accounts. After creating the machine account, a user has the permissions to register almost any type of SPMs on that machine, except a few that we'll mention later. Let's see some real-world example of this attack. The first one is Azure Ready Connect. Yes, Azure Ready Connect again. It's basically the same scenario as Eyal has already described, but this time we will inject the DC using Kerberos instead of NTLM. We won't show a demo for this because it's identical to the demo Eyal has already shown, but it's worth noting that when requesting the domain verification, Azure Ready Connect uses these two special STMs. These STMs are protected by Active Directory, and to be able to register them, you must have full control over the machine account. That's why we can't use the machine account quota trick for this attack, and this makes the scenario more difficult to achieve. Our second example is VMware Center. Administrators use vCenter to centralize the management of VMware E6 servers and the underlying virtual machine. vCenter supports Windows authentication, and it allows privileged mappings to AD security groups. That makes him vulnerable to this injection, which results in privilege escalation. Let's see the attack flow. We prepare our MiTM machine and register the needed STMs, in this case, we log on with an unprivileged account to the vCenter web UI. vCenter will start the authentication process, which is we have already described, we relate to VDC. Then, when assessing the user privileges, vCenter needs to translate the ID group names to the respective security IDs. In this case, we can intervene in those ad hoc searches and return a fake security IDs instead. For instance, when vCenter wants to translate domain admins to security ID, we can return the security ID for domain users, which results in every domain user having admin privileges in vCenter. Let's see a demo. Unfortunately, for this demo, we don't have the attacker's view, so I will try to describe what happens behind the scenes. Here we have vCenter machine, which we have already written. And now we see the configured roles on that machine. We see that we have configured an administrator role that is mapped to the ID group VM admins. And besides that, there is no other role mapped, meaning that for a domain user to be able to log on this server, he must be a member either directly or indirectly of VM admins. Now, let's select an end user without privileges. Here we have a regular user that is only a member of domain users. Okay. So let's log off from vCenter. So before logging on, I will mention that in the background we have two proxy scripts, one for LDAP and one for SMB, to serve all the requests that are done by vCenter. We use that LDAP proxy to answer LDAP searches that are occurring right now, and instead of returning the RID for VM admins, we return the RID of domain users, which, as you can see, allows regular user to log on to the machine, and he's now a full administrator in vCenter. Our third example is Beyond Trust Aided Bridge. Aided Bridge enables a Mac and Linux machine to join an AD domain. This allows us to configure privileges, for instance, sudo privileges, using AD security rules. And this application also is vulnerable to this injection, which results in privilege escalation. The attack flow is basically identical to what we have already shown in vCenter, except in this case, by default, after joining the domain, Linux allows any domain user to do SSH to the machine, but of course that user doesn't have sudo privileges. Then when we try to do sudo, we will intervene in the LDAP searches as we did before and return a fake RID. Let's see a demo. And again, sorry we don't have the attacker view here, but the scenario is pretty much the same. Let's see who has sudo machines on that privileges on this machine. You can see that the sudo privileges are mapped to two groups, domain admins and VM admins, and nothing else. So let's log off. And you see we are using regular user again, that doesn't have any privileges except for domain users. And now we do SSH using regular user, which, as I said, works by default, which is no surprise. But now we are trying to do sudo, and let's see if we succeed. Yeah, and regular user, which is just a member of domain admins, now has sudo privileges on this Linux machine. Okay, so how can this attack be mitigated? When an application ingests data from the DC, you must verify the DC identity first. The verification can be done either by establishing a network session and sending at least one message over it, or by using LDAP with certificate validation. Another option is to use Kerberos Armory, but we haven't tested it yet. As a side note, Windows GPO is still safe, since the GPO client does not pull any GPO unless there is an active network session against the chosen DC. Let's talk about the vulnerabilities. So Microsoft, on the NTLM injection, as Eyal has already said, it doesn't consider it as a vulnerability, but it did issue a guidance on how to disable the NTLM for the service account. For the Kerberos injection, Microsoft actually issued the CVE and already fixed the issue. Beyond Trust for AD Bridge has acknowledged the issue and are working on fix. And the same with VMware, they acknowledged the issue, working on a fix, and has issued a security advisory with a temporary workaround. Some closing remarks. Securing protocols from MiTM is very hard, as you have seen. And because of this, we believe this specific issue is very widespread, and we believe a lot more applications will be found that are vulnerable to this type of attacks. And Kerberos is not validating the disidentity properly, so it's up to the client to do so. And as we have seen, GSS API, either encryption or signing, does not guarantee protection from non-individual attacks. Some tips for defenders: always enable server client signing. If you don't do so, you only expose yourself to lots of more simpler attacks than what we have already shown. As we always say, monitor and reduce NTLM traffic, and treat your critical servers like Azure AD Connect, like VMware, the same as we would the domain controller. Regarding Kerberos injection, monitor for suspicious STMs. For instance, a regular machine that has an L.STM is suspicious. And in general, just try to avoid being MiTM. Thank you.